Martin Heidegger, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, revolutionized the way we think about existence, time, and the very nature of being itself. His work, particularly Being and Time, 1927, reoriented philosophy by emphasizing the fundamental question of being, a question that had been relegated to the background in much of Western philosophy. Heidegger's exploration of this question not only redefined metaphysical inquiry, but also set the stage for existentialism, phenomenology, and contemporary philosophy. In this episode, we'll delve into Heidegger's exploration of the question of being, his critique of traditional metaphysics, and his enduring influence on philosophy. Martin Heidegger's philosophy is often described as a radical departure from traditional metaphysical thought. His early work, particularly Being and Time, is considered one of the most profound investigations into the nature of human existence, ontology, and time. While influenced by phenomenology, especially Edmund Husserl, and existentialism, Heidegger's unique approach to the question of being sets him apart from these schools. He is often regarded as one of the most important figures in continental philosophy, and his impact has extended beyond philosophy into literature, theology, and even political theory. At the heart of Heidegger's thought lies what he called the question of being. This question concerns not individual beings, but being itself, the most fundamental aspect of existence that allows things to be what they are. Heidegger argued that Western philosophy, since the time of Plato, had forgotten the importance of this question. Philosophers, he claimed, had become preoccupied with specific beings and the categories used to describe them, neglecting the more fundamental issue of what it means for something to be at all. In his seminal work, Being and Time, Heidegger focused on the human condition, Dasein, or being there, to examine how we experience our existence and how this experience can help us understand the nature of being itself. By returning to the question of being, Heidegger aimed to shift philosophy away from abstract metaphysical discussions and toward a more concrete engagement of the world and human life. In this episode, we aim to explore Heidegger's profound contribution to the philosophical exploration of being. We will provide an overview of the historical context of the question of being, Heidegger's innovative approach in Being and Time, his critique of traditional metaphysics, and the lasting influence of his ideas on contemporary thought. The historical context of the question of being. The question of what is being has been a central issue in Western philosophy for centuries. The ancient Greeks, particularly Plato and Aristotle, laid the foundation for later metaphysical discussions about the nature of being. Aristotle's metaphysics is often considered the starting point for the Western tradition's formal consideration of being. In his exploration, Aristotle asked, "What does it mean for something to be?" This question, though treated with great seriousness in ancient thought, gradually became overshadowed by more specific inquiries about the nature of individual entities like substances, categories, or causes. After the medieval period, philosophers like Descartes, Kant, and Hegel took the question of being in new directions, but none of them fully confronted it in the way Heidegger would. For Descartes, for instance, being was closely tied to the thinking subject, famously encapsulated in his Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Kant, in his Critique of Pure Reason, introduced a distinction between the world as it appears to us, phenomena, and the world as it is in itself, noumena, relegating the question of being to an unknowable realm. Later, Hegel's dialectical method emphasized the unfolding of reality through a historical process, but again, the fundamental question of being was treated as part of a broader metaphysical system rather than something to be directly engaged with. The crisis of metaphysics. Heidegger believed that the great metaphysical systems, from Plato to Kant, had neglected the question of being itself. Western philosophy had become so focused on categorizing and analyzing particular beings, substances, or events that it lost sight of the more fundamental question of what it means for anything to be at all. Heidegger coined the term forgetting of being to describe this philosophical oversight. According to him, the development of metaphysical systems, including the rise of modern science and technology, had led to the neglect of the existential and ontological questions that should form the core of philosophy. Heidegger's critique of metaphysics was not simply that it had failed to answer the question of being, but that it had actively obscured it. He argued that the traditional metaphysical focus on substance, causality, and epistemology had masked the more pressing question of how we relate to the world in the first place. In Being and Time, Heidegger sought to reawaken the question of being by starting from an analysis of human existence. He argued that human beings, whom he called Dasein, literally being there, are uniquely positioned to ask the question of being because our existence is bound up with our awareness of our own finitude and temporality. By examining Dasein's experience of the world, Heidegger believed he could reveal the hidden structures of being itself. Overview of Being and Time. Being and Time is Heidegger's magnum opus and remains one of the most important philosophical texts of the 20th century. In this work, Heidegger tackles the problem of being by turning to the human experience, which he believes is the best way to understand the nature of being as such. The text is divided into two main parts. The first addresses the concept of Dasein, and the second focuses on temporality, which Heidegger views as fundamental to the question of being. While Being and Time is dense and complex, its central argument revolves around the idea that human existence, Dasein, is inseparable from the world it inhabits and the passage of time. Heidegger's analysis of Dasein opens up a new way of thinking about existence, one that challenges traditional metaphysical distinctions. Heidegger's concept of Dasein is central to his philosophy. Dasein refers not just to individual human beings, but to the very mode of existence that allows humans to ask about being. Heidegger argues that Dasein is always being in the world, meaning that our existence is always already embedded in a world of meaning, relations, and practices. Unlike animals which simply exist, Dasein is aware of its existence and therefore capable of reflecting on it. Dasein's self-awareness is crucial to Heidegger's investigation because it allows for the question of being to be posed. Heidegger emphasizes that Dasein is not an abstract, detached subject, but is always situated in a particular historical, cultural, and social context. This grounding in the world makes Dasein unique in its capacity to reflect on and question the nature of its existence. Heidegger's analysis of time. Heidegger's engagement with time is one of the most significant aspects of Being and Time. He argues that time is not a mere backdrop for events or an objective measurement, but is deeply connected to the structure of Dasein's existence. Time is an essential element in understanding being because it is through temporality that Dasein encounters its finitude. Heidegger distinguishes between ordinary time, which is often understood as a series of moments or a linear progression, and authentic time, which is rooted in Dasein's awareness of its own death. It is only when we confront our mortality that we can live authentically, understanding our existence as finite and contingent. In this sense, Heidegger redefines time as the medium through which we encounter being in its most fundamental form. Authenticity and inauthenticity. For Heidegger, an authentic existence is one in which Dasein confronts the reality of its own death and lives in accordance with this awareness. Inauthenticity, on the other hand, arises when Dasein avoids this confrontation and lives in a state of everydayness, distracted by the concerns of the world and the opinions of others. This distinction is important because it reveals how human beings can either engage with the question of being or ignore it. The anxiety that arises when we confront the finitude of existence is, according to Heidegger, a crucial part of what makes human life meaningful. Heidegger's critique of the Western metaphysical tradition. Heidegger's philosophy is deeply critical of the entire tradition of Western metaphysics, which he believes has lost sight of the question of being. According to Heidegger, the history of philosophy has been largely concerned with identifying and categorizing individual beings, such as substances or properties, and has neglected the more fundamental question of what it means for something to exist in the first place. Heidegger's critique is particularly pointed in relation to Descartes, Kant, and Hegel. Descartes' focus on the thinking subject, the cogito, isolates human beings from the world and reduces existence to subjective consciousness. Kant, with his distinction between phenomena and noumena, relegates the question of being to the unknowable realm of things in themselves. Hegel's dialectical system, while expansive and systematic, still treats being as a concept within a broader metaphysical structure rather than as something to be directly experienced. In his later work, Heidegger turned his attention to modern technology and its role in shaping human understanding of being. He argued that technology represents a form of inframing that reduces everything, including human beings, to mere resources or objects to be manipulated. Technology, for Heidegger, does not just involve tools or machines. It is a way of relating to the world that limits our ability to experience it authentically. Heidegger saw the rise of technology as a symptom of a deeper existential crisis, in which human beings no longer engage with the world in a way that allows for the unfolding of being. Instead, we treat everything, nature, people, even ourselves, as standing reserve, ready to be used for practical purposes. This, for Heidegger, represents the ultimate danger of modernity, the complete forgetfulness of being. Heidegger's turn, the later Heidegger. Heidegger's thought underwent a turn after Being and Time, which marked a shift from focusing primarily on human existence, Dasein, to a broader, more poetic approach to being. This later Heidegger, seen in works such as Poetry, Language, Thought, emphasized the importance of language and poetry in revealing the truth of being. He moved away from systematic philosophy to a more contemplative, meditative approach that considered the way being shows itself in everyday experiences. Heidegger's exploration of the question of being represents one of the most profound shifts in modern philosophy. By focusing on the existential experience of Dasein and the fundamental role of temporality, he redefined ontology and metaphysics. Heidegger's focus on the lived experience of human beings, as opposed to abstract concepts or systems, was groundbreaking. Despite criticisms and controversies, Heidegger's emphasis on the question of being remains deeply relevant in contemporary philosophy. His critique of modernity, particularly the role of technology, and his exploration of the relationship between time, existence, and authenticity, continue to inform discussions in existentialism, phenomenology, and even environmental philosophy. Heidegger's legacy is multifaceted. His thought challenges us to reconsider the ways in which we relate to the world, to each other, and to ourselves. While his philosophy remains controversial, particularly in light of his political affiliations, his work continues to provoke deep reflection on the nature of existence and the ways in which we can live authentically in an increasingly technological and alienated world. Through his radical return to the question of being, Heidegger invites us to confront the fundamental mysteries of existence and find new ways of engaging with the world.